Wendy was sitting at her office desk on a quiet Tuesday afternoon reviewing the final wedding contracts for her younger sister's ceremony when her phone suddenly buzzed beside her laptop. At first, she barely glanced at the screen expecting another vendor confirmation or floral update, but the moment she read the message from her mother, the entire room seemed to go silent around her. "You're not coming to the wedding. This family doesn't want you there." Before she could even process the words, another message appeared, this time from her father. "You make us look low class just by being there." Wendy stared at the screen for several long seconds, her fingers frozen above the leather binder that held 8 months of planning invoices and contracts she had personally handled for the wedding. Every flower arrangement, every catering deposit, every luxury detail had been arranged through her company and paid for with her own business account. Yet the people she had sacrificed for were now treating her like an embarrassment. Across the room, her assistant noticed the sudden change in Wendy's expression, but Wendy didn't cry, yell, or panic. Instead, something colder settled inside her, a calm, dangerous clarity. She slowly unlocked her phone, typed 4 simple words, and pressed send without hesitation. "So you're choosing status over blood." Then she quietly opened the wedding binder, uncapped her Mont Blanc pen, and began preparing to dismantle the entire wedding piece by piece. Most people in Wendy's family treated her like she was the least successful person in the room, but none of them knew the truth behind the wedding they were all so excited to attend. 12 years earlier, Wendy had dropped out of college after her father laughed across the kitchen table and told her she would never build anything important enough to carry the family name. Instead of breaking her, the humiliation pushed her harder. She started a small event planning company called Westbrook Events using her middle name because she no longer wanted to rely on a last name that had only ever made her feel small. Over the years, the company slowly grew from one exhausted woman with a folding table and borrowed decorations into a respected local business with 4 employees, reliable vendor relationships, and a reputation for delivering elegant weddings on impossible budgets. So when her younger sister Vivian got engaged and became overwhelmed by their mother's obsession with creating a luxury wedding worthy of impressing the wealthy Ashford family, Wendy stepped in without hesitation. She offered to handle everything personally as her wedding gift. For 8 straight months, Wendy devoted herself to making the day perfect. She attended menu tastings after work, compared floral samples during lunch breaks, negotiated venue discounts through years of business connections, and spent countless nights reviewing contracts long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The venue alone required an $18,000 final payment. The florist's custom wisteria installation cost thousands more. There were photographers, transportation services, rental linens, lighting crews, musicians, catering invoices, hotel suites, and specialty cakes. Every vendor knew Wendy by name because she was the one making the calls, signing the paperwork and guaranteeing payment. And the most important detail of all was something her mother conveniently ignored whenever she talked about the wedding to other people. Every single contract had Wendy's name on it. Every deposit came from her business account. More than $26,000 had already been paid directly from Westbrook Events to create the luxury wedding her mother dreamed about. Wendy never complained because she truly loved her sister and believed family was worth sacrificing for. While her parents were busy pretending to be part of high society, Wendy was the one quietly carrying the entire wedding on her shoulders, making impossible things happen behind the scenes without asking for praise, recognition, or even gratitude. After sending her final text to her mother, Wendy slowly placed her phone face down on the desk and pulled the thick leather wedding binder closer to her. The office suddenly felt unnaturally quiet, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her and the distant clicking of her assistant Hannah's keyboard. Inside the binder were 8 months of work contracts, receipts, payment schedules, floral sketches, catering menus, seating charts, and vendor agreements, every single page carrying Wendy's signature in dark black ink. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the paperwork, letting the reality settle into place. Her parents had just called her an embarrassment after she spent nearly a year building their dream wedding from the ground up. Something inside her turned cold and incredibly focused. Without another word, she uncapped her Mont Blanc pen, flipped open the contract index, and began dismantling the wedding piece by piece. The first call went to Catalina Blooms, the florist responsible for the custom wisteria arch her mother had obsessively demanded for the ceremony entrance. "Catalina, it's Wendy," she said calmly when the owner answered. "I need to cancel the Morgan Ashford order." "The full order." There was a brief silence on the line before Catalina quietly replied. "Are you okay?" Wendy closed her eyes for half a second before answering, "I'm fine. I just need the cancellation confirmation emailed tonight. No further questions were asked. The florist knew Wendy's reputation, knew she was professional, and knew something serious must have happened for her to walk away from an event this large. Within minutes, the cancellation email arrived. Deposit forfeited. Final payment voided. Wendy drew a straight line through the florist contract with her pen and moved to the next vendor. Catering. Transportation. Lighting crew. String quartet. Rental linens. Photography team. One by one, she called every company personally, and almost every vendor reacted the same way, with quiet loyalty to Wendy rather than the family that had insulted her. Some refunded deposits entirely because they respected her. Others waived cancellation penalties they legally could have kept. The DJ even told her he would rather lose a booking than see her treated badly after everything she had done for the wedding. As the afternoon continued, the checklist inside the binder filled with crossed-out contracts and canceled invoices. Thousands of dollars in future charges disappeared within hours because every agreement belonged to Wendy, not her parents. Every contract had her name on it. Around 4:20 p.m., her phone suddenly exploded with incoming calls from her mother. The first call she ignored. The second went unanswered. Then came voicemail after voicemail, followed by frantic text messages demanding explanations. Wendy never responded. Instead, she picked up the most important contract in the binder, Cresthaven Manor, the luxury venue her mother had bragged about to relatives for months. The final payment alone was scheduled to auto-draft $18,000 from Wendy's business account in less than 3 days. Wendy called the venue manager directly. "Eric," she said steadily when he answered, "I'm canceling the Morgan Ashford wedding, effective immediately." The manager went silent before carefully confirming the numbers. $4,000 forfeited. $18,000 refunded if canceled within the next 30 minutes. Wendy didn't hesitate for even a second. "Cancel it," she replied. "Send me written confirmation tonight." 16 minutes later, the email arrived in her inbox confirming the cancellation of the venue and the release of the wedding date. Wendy leaned back slowly in her chair and stared at the screen while her mother's calls continued flooding her phone in panic. Somewhere across town, her parents were only beginning to realize the horrifying truth: the wedding they had spent months using to impress wealthy people had never actually belonged to them. It belonged to Wendy, and now she was taking it back. Later that night, after Vivian left her apartment in tears, Wendy sat alone in complete silence with only the dim kitchen light glowing above the counter. The wedding binder was still lying open beside her, filled with crossed-out vendor contracts and cancellation confirmations, but for the first time all evening she felt emotionally exhausted instead of angry. She kept replaying the words her mother had sent her over and over in her head. "You make us look low class." The phrase didn't feel accidental anymore. It felt practiced, polished, almost rehearsed. That was when she remembered Vivian's laptop sitting untouched beneath a stack of unopened mail near the front door. Vivian had forgotten it at Wendy's apartment weeks earlier while working on seating charts, and in the chaos of the wedding disaster, neither of them had remembered to take it back. Wendy carried the laptop to the kitchen counter and opened it slowly. There was no password. Vivian never locked anything. The screen immediately lit up to an open messaging application still running in the browser. At first, Wendy only intended to text Vivian and ask if she had made it home safely, but as she scrolled through the message sidebar, one conversation near the bottom caught her attention. The group chat title was painfully simple: Mom, Dad, and Marge. Her stomach tightened immediately. A small, unread notification glowed beside the thread. Wendy hesitated for a long moment before clicking it open. What she found inside changed something in her permanently. The oldest messages dated back nearly 2 years. 2 years. Wendy sat down slowly at the kitchen counter as her eyes moved across the screen. The very first message from her mother read, "After the wedding, we need a plan to phase Wendy out gradually. She doesn't need to be included in everything anymore." Wendy blinked hard, rereading the sentence several times because her brain refused to fully process it. Phase Wendy out, as if she were an inconvenience. A problem to manage. Not a daughter. Not a sister. Another message from Aunt Marjorie appeared directly underneath. "She means well, but she doesn't fit the picture we're trying to present." Then her father responded only minutes later. "Agreed. Let's not create drama before the engagement. We'll handle it slowly." Wendy felt all the air leave her lungs at once. Her hands became cold against the keyboard while the kitchen remained terrifyingly quiet around her. She kept scrolling. Month after month of conversations unfolded in front of her like evidence from a trial she never knew existed. Her mother complained about Wendy's clothes before family dinners. Aunt Marjorie mocked her career and called her aggressively middle class. Her father repeatedly agreed with them, in short, emotionless replies that somehow hurt even more because of how casual they were. Then Wendy found the message that made her physically stop breathing for a second. It was sent after the Ashford engagement party. Beatrice keeps asking about Wendy's business, her mother had written. We need to redirect those conversations. She'll think we come from rough stock. Another message followed only minutes later from Aunt Marjorie. Honestly, Wendy makes the whole family look low class standing next to the Ashfords. Wendy stared at the word so long the screen dimmed automatically. Low class. They had been saying it for years behind her back, long before the wedding, long before the text message. Her mother hadn't typed those words in anger. She had typed them because she truly believed them. Wendy pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth as a deep, crushing silence settled over her chest. She remembered every holiday she had quietly paid for, every birthday she had organized, every emergency she had solved for the family without hesitation. She remembered driving Vivian to school when their parents were busy helping her through breakups, staying up late sewing dress hems before dances, and spending 8 exhausting months building the perfect wedding because she genuinely loved her sister. And all that time, her parents had been discussing how to slowly erase her from family photographs and future gatherings as if she were embarrassing clutter. She kept scrolling, even though every message hurt worse than the one before it. After the rehearsal dinner, Wendy can say she has a work emergency. She doesn't belong around people like the Ashfords. If we do this carefully, she'll think distancing herself was her own choice. Wendy didn't cry. Somehow the betrayal was too deep for tears at first. Instead, she sat completely motionless in the dark kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, while years of hidden cruelty unfolded line by line in front of her. Every message stripped away another illusion she had spent her entire life protecting. By the time she reached the most recent text, the one sent only days earlier about officially uninviting her from the wedding, Wendy finally leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The pain inside her was no longer explosive. It was quieter than that. Colder. More final. In that moment, she realized something devastating: her family had not suddenly betrayed her. They had simply stopped pretending they loved her enough to hide it anymore. Vivian showed up at Wendy's apartment late that night, with mascara streaked down her cheeks and panic written all over her face. The moment Wendy opened the door, she could tell her younger sister had been crying for hours. Vivian stepped inside without saying much at first, still wearing the same coat from earlier, her hands trembling slightly as she sat down on the hallway floor, like she used to when they were children. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with years of family tension neither sister had fully understood until now. Finally, Vivian looked up with red, exhausted eyes and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Wendy stared at her for a second, not angry anymore, just tired in a way she had never felt before. "Vivian," she said softly, "Mom texted me and told me I make this family look low class." Dad agreed with her. Vivian immediately shook her head through tears. "She didn't mean it like that," she whispered automatically, repeating the defense their mother had probably been feeding her all day. But even as she said the words, her voice lacked conviction. Wendy could see it happening in real time, the first crack in the version of reality their mother had carefully built around her. Wendy calmly explained everything: the canceled vendors, the contracts, the money, the humiliating messages. She reminded Vivian that every single part of the wedding their mother had proudly shown off to relatives had been paid for by her own business account. Every flower arrangement, every reservation, every luxury detail. "I wasn't trying to ruin your wedding," Wendy said quietly. "I was removing my name from things I paid for after being told I wasn't welcome anymore." Vivian covered her mouth with both hands as tears spilled harder down her face. For the first time, she seemed to realize the full weight of what had happened. "Mom told me you were overreacting," she whispered. "She said you were trying to make everything about yourself." Wendy gave a small, painful smile. "Of course she did." Vivian looked down at the floor, completely shaken now. "I didn't know," she admitted in a broken voice. "I swear to God, Wendy, I didn't know she said those things to you." Wendy believed her. That was the hardest part. Vivian had always been softer than the rest of them, easier to manipulate, desperate to keep peace inside the family, even when the peace came at someone else's expense. She had trusted their mother because she wanted to believe the family was still normal. But now that illusion was collapsing in front of her. Vivian wiped her eyes roughly with her sleeve and looked back up at her sister. Did she really say I was worth more than you? The question hung painfully in the hallway between them. Wendy could have softened the truth. She could have lied to protect her sister from the full ugliness of it all. But after everything she had read that night, she no longer had the energy to protect people from reality. No, Wendy answered honestly. She said you embarrassed her less. Vivian physically flinched as though the words had struck her across the face. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. Then very quietly she whispered, I'm so sorry. Wendy felt something inside her loosen slightly at those words. Not healed, not fixed, but softer. Vivian moved closer, her voice trembling harder now. I should have seen it sooner. I should have defended you. Wendy looked at her little sister sitting on the hallway floor crying in front of her and suddenly remembered every version of Vivian she had ever loved, the little girl who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who called Wendy first after every heartbreak, the younger sister who once saved up for months just to buy her the Mont Blanc pen sitting on the kitchen counter. Vivian was not innocent in all of this, but she was not cruel either. She was another person caught inside the gravity of their mother's manipulation. Wendy reached over slowly and squeezed her hand. I'm angry, she admitted softly. But I don't hate you. Vivian broke down, crying harder at that relief, and guilt crashing together across her face. Please don't give up on me, she whispered. Wendy looked at her for a long moment before answering quietly. That depends on what you do next. Vivian nodded through tears because deep down she finally understood something important. This was no longer about choosing peace inside the family. It was about choosing the truth. Friday afternoon arrived gray and quiet as Wendy drove through one of Sacramento's oldest neighborhoods toward the Ashford residence, with the wedding binder sitting heavily on the passenger seat beside her. She had barely slept the night before, yet strangely she felt calmer than she had in days. The house itself was nothing like the flashy mansions her mother always bragged about after country club dinners. There were no towering gates, no marble fountains, no dramatic displays of wealth meant to impress strangers. Instead, the Ashford home sat quietly behind a low white fence beneath massive valley oak trees, elegant in a way that felt effortless rather than performative. The front porch held a wooden swing with faded cushions, and when the front door opened, Beatrice Ashford herself stood there in a soft beige cardigan, holding the screen door open with one hand. Wendy, she said warmly, as though welcoming an old friend instead of the center of a family scandal. Come in. The tea is ready. The interior of the house felt lived in rather than decorated for appearances. Bookshelves lined entire walls. Framed black and white family photographs sat slightly uneven on side tables. There was a piano in the corner with open sheet music resting on top of it, proof someone actually used it instead of displaying it for status. Wendy immediately understood something her mother never had. This was what real wealth looked like. Quiet. Comfortable. Secure enough not to constantly announce itself. Beatrice led her into a sitting room overlooking the garden and poured tea herself without calling for staff or pretending to be above simple things. There was no performance in her movements, no forced elegance. Every gesture felt natural. Wendy placed the thick wedding binder carefully on the small table between them, and for several seconds neither woman spoke. Finally, Beatrice adjusted her reading glasses and said gently, I'd like to understand what really happened. Wendy opened the binder and began laying documents out one by one across the table. Vendor invoices, venue contracts, bank statements, floral orders, catering payments. Every page carried the same signature at the bottom, Wendy Morgan, Westbrook Events. Beatrice read everything slowly and thoroughly, never interrupting, never pretending to already know the answers. The silence in the room grew heavier with every page she turned. The total payments exceeded $26,000, all from Wendy's business account. Every luxury detail Wendy's mother had proudly shown off for months had actually been funded and organized by the daughter she later called low class. After several minutes, Beatrice finally looked up from the paperwork, her expression calm but noticeably colder than before. Your mother told my husband your event business was more of a side hobby, she said carefully. Wendy let out a quiet breath of disbelief. I employ 4 people, she replied evenly. We planned 11 weddings last year and several 6-figure corporate events. Cresthaven gave us preferred vendor pricing because I've worked with them for years. Beatrice stared at her for another long moment before nodding once almost to herself. I thought as much. There was no dramatic reaction, no exaggerated outrage. That was the thing about Beatrice Ashford, she didn't need theatrics to establish authority. Unlike Wendy's mother, who constantly performed sophistication for approval, Beatrice carried power so naturally she never had to announce it. She simply absorbed the truth quietly, and somehow that made it feel even more devastating. Wendy then handed her the printed screenshots from the family group chat. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Beatrice read every message carefully, including the ones about phasing Wendy out, the insults about her appearance, the repeated use of the phrase low class, and the discussions about hiding Wendy from the Ashfords because she didn't fit. The picture. Wendy watched Beatrice's expression harden ever so slightly with every page. Finally, after several long minutes of silence, Beatrice removed her glasses and folded the screenshots neatly back into the folder. I grew up in a foreclosure house in Sacramento, she said calmly. My father was a mechanic. My husband and I built everything we own from one duplex and a bank loan. I have no patience for class theater. Wendy felt something shift inside her at those words. For the first time since the nightmare began, someone important finally saw her clearly, not as an embarrassment, not as a social liability, but as the competent, hard-working woman she had spent years becoming. Beatrice stood and walked toward a small antique writing desk near the window. She opened a drawer, removed a thick, cream-colored place card, and picked up a silver fountain pen. Wendy watched quietly as Beatrice wrote her name in elegant calligraphy across the card. Wendy Morgan, she said softly, while the ink dried. Then she looked directly at Wendy and added Ashford family table. Wendy stared at the card for a moment, unable to speak. The gesture itself was simple, but the meaning behind it was enormous. Beatrice was not merely inviting her to the wedding, she was publicly choosing a side. In that moment, the contrast between the two women became painfully obvious. Wendy's mother had spent years pretending to be part of high society by tearing down her own daughter to impress wealthy people. Beatrice, a woman with actual status and influence, found that behavior pathetic. One woman believed class was about appearances. The other understood it was about character. And for the first time in Wendy's life, someone powerful had looked directly at her and decided she belonged exactly where she was. The collapse of the original wedding happened faster than anyone in Wendy's family expected. Once Cresthaven Manor officially released the reservation date, panic spread through the Morgan household almost immediately. Sacramento's luxury wedding season had been fully booked for months, and every high-end venue Wendy's mother desperately called either laughed politely at the timeline or quoted impossible emergency pricing they couldn't afford. The elegant ballroom with crystal chandeliers, imported orchids and custom lighting designs that Wendy had spent 8 months arranging vanished overnight because the only person legally connected to the contracts had walked away. For the first time, Wendy's mother was forced to face a reality she had spent years avoiding. She had depended entirely on the daughter she considered embarrassing. By Thursday morning, after dozens of frantic phone calls and failed negotiations, the family had no choice but to reserve the only location still available on such short notice: a Holiday Inn conference ballroom near the airport. The moment Wendy heard the news from her cousin, she almost couldn't picture it. Her mother had spent months bragging to relatives about Cresthaven Manor's luxury garden entrance and marble reception hall, only for the wedding to end up in a beige hotel ballroom with fluorescent lighting and water-stained ceiling tiles. The irony was almost too perfect. Every expensive detail Wendy had carefully designed disappeared one after another. The plated 5-course catering menu was replaced with a rushed buffet line serving teriyaki chicken, mashed potatoes, and overcooked vegetarian pasta under metal warming trays. The custom lavender buttercream cake Wendy had ordered from a private bakery was replaced by a large white Costco sheet cake decorated with generic icing flowers. The imported floral arrangements became grocery store roses and baby's breath shoved into simple glass vases. The live string quartet was gone. The elegant cocktail bar vanished. Even the signature lavender French 75 cocktail Wendy's mother had insisted on during planning meetings was replaced with cheap Chardonnay and bottles of domestic beer sitting in melting ice buckets. Worst of all for Wendy's mother, everyone knew exactly why the downgrade had happened. She tried desperately to control the narrative, telling extended family members there had been a construction issue at Cresthaven Manor and claiming the simpler venue was an intentional return to elegance and intimacy. Nobody believed her. Relatives exchanged awkward glances behind her back, while country club friends quietly pieced together the truth through gossip spreading across Sacramento's event industry. The humiliation became impossible to hide because the contrast was too dramatic. Just 2 weeks earlier, Wendy's mother had been showing off luxury seating charts and imported floral samples like trophies. Now she was walking guests into a Holiday Inn ballroom beside a vending machine and a faded conference sign holder. Every detail of the cheaper wedding became a visible reminder of what had been lost the moment Wendy canceled the contracts. And the cruelest part of it all was that Wendy never had to publicly embarrass her mother herself. The ballroom did it for her. The buffet did it for her. The Costco cake did it for her. Every fluorescent light buzzing overhead silently exposed the truth her mother had spent years trying to hide. The daughter, she called low class, had been the only reason any of them looked sophisticated in the first place. By the time the reception officially began, the tension inside the Holiday Inn ballroom had already become impossible to ignore. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while guests awkwardly balanced cheap wine glasses beside folding buffet tables covered with white cloths that never quite reached the floor evenly. Wendy stood quietly near the portable hotel bar with a glass of water in her hand, trying to stay invisible for Vivian's sake. But she could feel her mother staring at her from across the room every few minutes. The anger in Cordelia's face had been building all evening like pressure inside a sealed container. Finally, sometime during cocktail hour, she snapped. Wendy saw her mother marching across the ballroom in sharp, furious steps before she even reached her. The pearl pin on her dress flashed under the ugly hotel lighting as she stopped inches away from Wendy's face. "How dare you?" she hissed through clenched teeth. Several nearby relatives immediately fell silent. Wendy didn't move. "Mom," she said calmly, "you're at a wedding. Lower your voice." That only made Cordelia angrier. "Look at this place," she whispered harshly, gesturing around the ballroom with shaking hands. "Look what you've done to this family. You ruined your sister's wedding because you were jealous." Wendy stared at her quietly for a moment before answering. "No. I stopped financing a wedding after being told I wasn't welcome at it." Cordelia opened her mouth to argue again, but another voice interrupted her before she could speak. "Cordelia." The single word instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. Beatrice Ashford had approached from the other side of the ballroom with Gerald Ashford beside her and Trent following several steps behind. Vivian stood close to her new husband, visibly nervous, her eyes moving anxiously between her mother and Wendy. Beatrice remained perfectly calm, but there was something commanding in the way she carried herself that made nearby conversations immediately die out around her. "I think," Beatrice said politely, "there's something we should clarify before the evening continues." Cordelia's expression shifted instantly into forced social politeness. "Beatrice, really, now isn't the time." Actually, Beatrice interrupted softly. "I think this is the perfect time." Without raising her voice, she gently guided the group toward the center of the ballroom near the dance floor where the toasts were supposed to happen later. One by one, guests began noticing the movement and slowly gathered closer. Conversations faded. Forks lowered. Even the bartender stopped wiping glasses. Wendy remained silent while Beatrice stepped into the middle of the room holding a cream-colored manila envelope beneath one arm. Gerald Ashford tapped a butter knife lightly against his water glass once, and the ballroom fell completely quiet. Beatrice looked around the room slowly before speaking. "Over the last several months," she began calmly, "my husband and I have had the pleasure of getting to know both families involved in this wedding. But there's something important we recently learned that I believe deserves clarification." Wendy saw her mother's face tighten immediately. "Beatrice," Cordelia warned weakly. Beatrice ignored her. She opened the envelope carefully and removed a stack of printed invoices. "These," she said while lifting the papers slightly, "are the original contracts for the wedding that was supposed to take place at Cresthaven Manor." Murmurs spread softly through the room. Beatrice continued reading. "Venue booking, $18,000. Catering, $9,400. Floral installation, $7,800. Photography, transportation, lighting, entertainment." She turned another page slowly. "Total prepaid expenses, $26,000. Wendy's father had gone completely pale by now, but Beatrice still wasn't finished. She lowered the invoices slightly and spoke the next sentence clearly enough for every person in the ballroom to hear. Every single payment came from one account, Westbrook Events. Account holder Wendy Morgan. Silence crashed over the room so heavily it almost felt physical. Several guests turned toward Wendy in complete disbelief. Cordelia immediately tried to speak. Wendy offered to help, no. Beatrice interrupted, still calm but noticeably colder now. Wendy funded your daughter's wedding. The words landed like a bomb in the center of the ballroom. Wendy saw Aunt Marjorie physically sit down in the nearest chair as if her knees had suddenly stopped working. Her father stared at the floor without speaking. Vivian's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. But Beatrice still had more. She calmly removed another stack of papers from the envelope, printed screenshots from the family group chat. Cordelia visibly stopped breathing for half a second when she saw them. I also had the unfortunate opportunity, Beatrice continued evenly, to read several conversations discussing Wendy over the last 2 years. Her mother's voice cracked immediately. That was private. Beatrice looked directly at her. So was your daughter's humiliation. The room became so quiet that Wendy could hear the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. Beatrice read directly from the printed pages. We need to phase Wendy out gradually. She turned another page. She doesn't fit the picture we're trying to present. Another page. Beatrice will think we come from rough stock if Wendy is around too much. Cordelia's face had gone completely white by then. Several relatives were openly staring at her in shock. Then Beatrice lowered the papers slowly and delivered the sentence that shattered whatever remained of the illusion Wendy's parents had spent years building. You told her she makes you look low class, Beatrice said quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air like broken glass. Beatrice's voice remained perfectly composed as she continued. I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. I grew up in a foreclosure house in Sacramento. My father was a mechanic. My husband and I built our life ourselves. I have no respect for people who perform class while humiliating their own child behind closed doors. Wendy finally looked at her mother then. The pearl pin on Cordelia's dress sat crooked against the fabric now. Her makeup had begun to streak slightly beneath her eyes. For the first time in Wendy's life, her mother no longer looked powerful. She looked small, desperate, exposed. Vivian suddenly crossed the ballroom floor toward Wendy through complete silence and stopped beside her. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there next to her sister in front of everyone. That alone said enough. Wendy finally spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice stayed calm, almost frighteningly calm. I didn't ruin this wedding, she said softly. I just stopped paying for people who were ashamed of me. No one in the room could argue with her because every piece of evidence was already sitting in Beatrice Ashford's hands. The ballroom remained completely silent after Beatrice finished speaking. No one moved. No one defended Wendy's parents. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, while dozens of relatives stood frozen around the dance floor staring at the shattered remains of the image Cordelia had spent years trying to protect. Wendy looked around the room, slowly taking in the faces of cousins, aunts, family friends, and country club acquaintances who finally understood the truth. Yet despite everything that had just happened, she felt strangely calm. There was no satisfaction in humiliating her parents publicly, no triumphant rush, only clarity. Years of confusion, guilt, and self-doubt had finally burned away, leaving something quieter and stronger underneath. Her mother opened her mouth as if she wanted to argue again, but no words came out this time. Even Richard remained silent beside her, staring helplessly at the floor. Wendy realized then that she no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed to explain herself, defend herself, or beg to be treated like family. That chapter had ended the moment they decided her love, money, and loyalty were useful while her existence was embarrassing. Wendy finally spoke, her voice steady and controlled. Mom, she said softly, I spent years trying to earn respect from people who only cared about appearances. I'm done doing that. Cordelia's eyes filled instantly, but Wendy did not stop. You taught me something important this week. If someone is ashamed of you in private, they don't deserve your sacrifices in public. The room stayed silent. Wendy turned toward Vivian then, and for a second, the anger disappeared entirely from her expression. All she saw was her little sister standing there in a wedding dress, crying quietly under harsh ballroom lights. None of this had been the wedding Vivian dreamed about. But Wendy could still see the frightened little girl she had protected her whole life underneath all the chaos. Slowly, Wendy stepped closer and gently kissed Vivian on the side of her head, the same way she used to when they were children. Be happy, she whispered softly. Trent is a good man. Don't let this become your life, too. Vivian broke down, crying harder at that, but Wendy simply squeezed her hand once before letting go. Then, without another argument, without raising her voice, and without looking back at her parents, Wendy picked up her clutch and calmly walked away from the center of the ballroom. Guests silently moved aside as she crossed the room. The cheap carpet muffled the sound of her heels while conversations remained frozen behind her. Near the exit, Beatrice reached out briefly and touched Wendy's hand. "Drive safely, Wendy," she said quietly. Wendy nodded once with a faint smile before continuing toward the lobby doors. Outside, the evening air felt cool against her skin after the suffocating tension inside the ballroom. She walked alone across the parking lot beneath the fading Sacramento sunset, finally understanding something that took her years to learn: dignity was not something her family could give or take away from her. She already had it the moment she chose to walk away without becoming cruel like them. 6 months after the wedding, Wendy's life looked completely different, though not in the way her parents once feared. Instead of collapsing under the humiliation and betrayal, she quietly became stronger. Westbrook events began growing faster than ever, partly because Sacramento's event industry had heard the story through whispers and vendor conversations long before the family ever stopped talking about it. People respected the way Wendy handled everything, not with screaming revenge posts or public meltdowns, but with calm professionalism and dignity. Several new clients came directly through the Ashford social network, though Beatrice never openly admitted she was recommending Wendy's company behind the scenes. She didn't need to. In wealthy circles, reputation traveled quietly. Within a few months, Wendy hired a second full-time coordinator for the business and expanded into larger corporate events she once thought were beyond her reach. Ironically, the same family connections her mother tried so desperately to protect ended up benefiting Wendy instead. Meanwhile, her relationship with Vivian slowly began healing in small, careful steps. They started meeting for coffee once a month without discussing their parents at first. Sometimes Trent joined them, always polite, always visibly ashamed he had not understood what was happening sooner. Vivian apologized more than once, but Wendy eventually realized her sister had spent most of her life trapped under the same emotional pressure and manipulation she had finally escaped. Forgiveness did not happen overnight, but trust slowly returned piece by piece because Vivian finally stopped defending behavior she knew was wrong. Their relationship became quieter, more honest, and somehow stronger than before. Wendy, however, never rebuilt things with her parents. Her mother called several times during the months after the wedding, but Wendy never answered. Her father mailed a Christmas card in December with a short message pretending nothing serious had happened. Wendy returned it unopened. For the first time in her life, she understood that protecting her peace mattered more than maintaining appearances. The silence between them no longer felt painful. It felt necessary. One of the few relationships Wendy genuinely valued afterward was the unexpected friendship she developed with Beatrice Ashford. True to her word, Beatrice invited Wendy to tea every few months. They talked about business, books, event trends, and occasionally Vivian, but they almost never discussed the wedding itself. Neither woman needed to revisit it constantly because they both understood what had really happened. Beatrice once told Wendy something she never forgot while pouring Earl Grey into delicate porcelain cups one rainy afternoon. "Real class," she said calmly, "is how people treat those they think they no longer need." That sentence stayed with Wendy longer than any apology ever could. Over time, Wendy realized the greatest irony in the entire situation was that the people most obsessed with appearing sophisticated had been the least dignified people in the room. Her mother spent decades climbing imaginary social ladders, terrified of being judged by wealthier people, while Beatrice, a woman with actual status influence and old money connections, saw cruelty and insecurity as the true signs of low class. In the end, Wendy stopped mourning the version of family she wished she had and started appreciating the life she built herself. She still kept the Mont Blanc pen on her desk beside the leather event binder, and every time she signed a new contract, she remembered exactly what the wedding taught her. Love without respect eventually becomes exploitation. Loyalty without boundaries becomes permission to be mistreated. And status. Status was the easiest thing in the world to fake. Wendy had learned the difference the hard way. As she locked her office one evening after another successful client meeting, she glanced at the rows of signed event folders inside her cabinet and smiled quietly to herself. After everything her family said about her, one truth remained impossible to deny. Status doesn't pay deposits. She does.